Hello friends, please like and subscribe to the channel and enjoy the stories. Chapter 1: The City of Echoes. The city of Montreal in early autumn was a symphony of changing colors and bustling streets. The leaves on the trees lining Sherbrooke Street turned shades of gold and fiery red, whispering softly as the wind played through their branches. The chill in the air was gentle, just enough to warrant scarves and light jackets, and the scent of roasting coffee beans drifted out from the cafes that punctuated every corner. Amara was late. She knew this, but she didn't care. Her steps were deliberately slow as she made her way past the crowd gathered outside a jazz club, her boots clicking against the pavement. The truth was, she wasn't sure she wanted to be on time for her blind date. Her roommate, Clara, had set it up, insisting it was time for Amara to meet someone who wasn't just another brooding artist. But Amara liked brooding artists. They understood the chaos in her sketches, the frayed edges of her heart. She rounded the corner and spotted the cafe, a quaint, dimly lit space tucked between a used bookstore and a flower shop. She paused, adjusting her scarf nervously. Through the fogged glass, she could see a figure sitting at a table near the window, head bent over a book. He looked ordinary, brown hair, glasses, a jacket that seemed a size too big. But there was something in the way he turned the pages, carefully as if afraid of damaging them, that made her curious. Amara stepped inside, the warmth of the cafe wrapping around her like an embrace. She spotted him immediately, and he looked up as the bell above the door chimed. His gaze met hers, and for a moment the noise of the cafe fell away. "You must be Amara," he said, standing up awkwardly. His voice was soft, with a slight accent she couldn't quite place. "And you must be Ryan," she replied, offering a tentative smile. He gestured to the seat across from him, and she sat down, smoothing her skirt over her knees. The air between them was heavy with first-meeting nerves, but Ryan's earnestness made it easier than she had expected. They talked about everything and nothing. Her love of sketching people in parks, his fascination with astrophysics, the way both of them loved the sound of rain on rooftops. It turned out they were both from small towns, trying to carve out lives in the vastness of the city. Amara shared how she often felt like a ghost, floating through the streets unnoticed, while Ryan admitted he sometimes felt like he was watching life happen through a telescope, always at a distance. By the time the cafe closed, they were still talking. Ryan suggested walking her home, and she agreed. The city was quieter now, the streets illuminated by the soft glow of streetlights. They strolled side by side, their steps falling into an easy rhythm. "I'm glad Clara convinced you to come," Ryan said, glancing at her with a shy smile. Amara hesitated. "Me too," she said, though a part of her felt like she was stepping onto the edge of something she couldn't yet define. When they reached her apartment, she turned to face him. "Thanks for walking me home," she said. "Anytime," he replied, and for a moment they lingered there, the night stretching around them. Ryan left with a wave, and Amara watched him go, a strange warmth settling in her chest. She didn't know then that this moment, small and unassuming, would be the beginning of something that would change them both forever. Chapter 2: The Gravity Between Us. In the days that followed, Amara found herself thinking about Ryan more often than she expected. His laugh, quiet and genuine. The way he tilted his head when she spoke, as if he were memorizing every word. She caught herself doodling his face in the margins of her sketchbook, her pencil lingering over the curve of his glasses or the softness of his smile. But Amara wasn't used to this, letting someone occupy her thoughts so completely. She had spent so much of her life guarding her heart, retreating into her art whenever the world felt too loud or people too close. Yet something about Ryan's quiet presence felt safe. He wasn't demanding or overwhelming. He simply was. On Thursday evening, as the city prepared itself for another crisp autumn night, Amara got a text from Ryan. "Hey, there's this lecture on black holes at the planetarium tonight. It's probably the nerdiest thing you've ever been invited to, but want to come?" She stared at her phone, biting her lip. The idea of sitting in a dark room surrounded by strangers, listening to someone talk about stars collapsing into themselves, wasn't exactly her idea of fun. But the thought of Ryan waiting for her, glancing at the door each time it opened, was enough to make her type a quick reply. Sounds interesting. What time? The planetarium was bathed in a soft blue glow when she arrived. Ryan was already waiting outside, a scarf wrapped around his neck and his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets. His face lit up when he saw her, and for reasons she couldn't explain, that simple reaction made her heart ache. "You came," he said, as if he hadn't expected her to. "You made it sound too intriguing to miss," she teased, falling into step beside him as they entered. The lecture hall was intimate, the ceiling painted to resemble the night sky. Amara leaned back in her seat as the lights dimmed, letting the speaker's voice wash over her. They talked about the life cycle of stars, the impossibility of escape from a black hole's event horizon, and the mind-bending concept of time dilation. Ryan, she noticed, was completely absorbed. His eyes were wide with wonder, and he leaned forward slightly, as if trying to absorb every detail. Amara smiled to herself, more focused on him than the lecture. When the talk ended, the two of them wandered outside, the cool air nipping at their cheeks. "So," Ryan began, "what did you think? Mind sufficiently blown?" "It was fascinating," Amara admitted, though she was sure she hadn't grasped half of it. "I can see why you like this stuff." "It's the idea that there's so much more out there," Ryan said, his breath fogging in the air. "Things we'll never fully understand but can still marvel at. It's humbling, you know." Amara nodded, though her gaze was fixed on him. "I think I get it." They walked in comfortable silence for a while, the city alive around them. Amara found herself opening up, sharing bits of herself she usually kept hidden, how she came to Montreal to escape the suffocating expectations of her family, how art was the only thing that made her feel whole. Ryan listened without interrupting, his expression soft with understanding. At one point, he stopped abruptly, looking up at the sky. "Look," he said, pointing. Amara followed his gaze. Between the buildings, in a rare break in the city's light pollution, a handful of stars were visible. They were faint, but they were there. "You don't see them often in the city," Ryan said. "They're beautiful," Amara murmured. "So are you," he said softly, almost as if the words had escaped without permission. Amara's breath caught. She looked at him, her heart pounding, and for a moment the world seemed to hold its breath. "I mean," Ryan stammered, his face turning red. "Sorry, that just—" "Don't apologize," Amara interrupted, her voice barely above a whisper. And then, before she could overthink it, she leaned in and kissed him. It was a small kiss, tentative and unsure, but it was enough to send a spark racing through her. When they pulled apart, Ryan looked stunned but undeniably happy. "That was unexpected," he said, grinning. "Unexpected can be good," Amara replied, her cheeks warm. As they continued walking, their hands brushed. Tentatively, Ryan reached out and took hers, his fingers wrapping around hers with a surprising confidence. For the first time in a long time, Amara felt like she wasn't floating aimlessly through the world. She had gravity now, and it felt like it was pulling her toward Ryan. Chapter 3. Threads of Tomorrow. The weeks unfolded like pages in a book. Amara couldn't stop reading. Her days, once quiet and solitary, now carried the rhythm of laughter and shared secrets. Ryan became a constant, a soft presence she found herself leaning into without realizing it. They built rituals together. Sunday afternoons were for browsing secondhand bookstores, their fingers tracing over spines as they debated the merits of different authors. Tuesday nights were for exploring hidden corners of the city, from forgotten alleys with murals to tiny bistros serving steaming bowls of pho. Ryan was the kind of person who found joy in the smallest things. He'd stop mid-walk to marvel at the intricate frost patterns on a car window, or point out a squirrel's antics as if it were the most important event of the day. Amara often found herself sketching these moments later, trying to capture the wonder he carried so effortlessly. But for all his openness, Ryan kept parts of himself guarded. There were moments when he'd grow distant, his gaze fixed on some unseen horizon. Amara noticed it one evening as they sat on her couch, a movie playing but long forgotten as they talked. "What's on your mind?" she asked softly, brushing her fingers against his. Ryan hesitated, the question hanging in the air. "Nothing," he said after a moment, offering her a small smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Amara wanted to press him, but she didn't. Instead, she shifted closer, resting her head against his shoulder. Whatever burden he was carrying, she hoped he'd share it when he was ready. It was mid-November when the first snow fell. Amara woke to find the city blanketed in white, the trees and rooftops softened by the delicate layer. She texted Ryan, her excitement bubbling over. "It's snowing! Let's go for a walk." He responded almost instantly. "Meet me at Mount Royal in an hour." When Amara arrived, bundled in her thickest coat and scarf, she found Ryan waiting at the base of the park's winding trail. His cheeks were pink from the cold, and his eyes lit up when he saw her. "You ready for this?" he asked, grinning. They climbed together, the world around them quiet except for the crunch of snow underfoot. The air smelled clean, and their breath hung in puffs before dissolving into the sky. At the summit, the city stretched out before them, its buildings muted by the snowfall. Amara turned to Ryan, her heart swelling at the way he was taking it all in, as if seeing it for the first time. "It's beautiful," she said. "So are you," he replied, his voice soft but certain. Amara felt her chest tighten. She reached for him, and their hands met, his fingers cold but steady against hers. They stood there for a long time, watching the snow fall over Montreal, the silence between them comfortable. It wasn't until later that things began to shift. Amara noticed the signs in small ways at first. Ryan would cancel plans at the last minute, his excuses vague. When they were together, he'd sometimes drift into silences that felt heavier than they should. One evening, after a dinner that had felt more strained than usual, Amara finally confronted him. "Ryan," she said, her voice steady despite the knot in her stomach, "what's going on? You've been distant." He looked at her, his expression conflicted. For a moment, she thought he might deflect, but then he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "There's something I need to tell you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Amara's heart pounded. She waited, her mind racing through possibilities. "I'm leaving," he said finally. The words hit her like a blow. "What do you mean, leaving?" "My application to the research program at Cambridge. I didn't think I'd get in, but I did," he said, his words tumbling out in a rush. "It starts in January." Amara stared at him, her thoughts a chaotic mess. "January," she echoed. "That's 6 weeks away." "I didn't know how to tell you," Ryan admitted, his voice breaking. "I didn't want to hurt you." Tears pricked at Amara's eyes, but she blinked them back. "You should have told me," she said, her voice trembling. "I know," he said, reaching for her, but she stepped back. The weight of his choice hung between them, and for the first time, Amara felt the sharp edge of the gravity that had once drawn them together. Chapter 4. Splinters in the Snow. The days after Ryan's confession passed in a haze. Amara couldn't focus on her sketches, her lines coming out shaky and uneven. The Montreal winter deepened, the city draped in its cold beauty, but Amara felt none of its charm. Ryan reached out, sending texts and leaving voicemails. He wanted to talk, to explain, but she wasn't ready. Not yet. A week later, she finally agreed to meet him. They chose a small cafe far from their usual spots, a neutral ground where the weight of their connection might feel less suffocating. Ryan was already there when Amara arrived, sitting at a table near the window. He looked up as she approached, relief flickering across his face. "Thanks for coming," he said softly. Amara nodded, slipping into the chair across from him. She wrapped her hands around her mug, letting the warmth seep into her fingers. "I'm sorry," Ryan began. His voice carried a rawness she hadn't heard before. "I should have told you earlier. I was scared." "Scared of what?" Amara asked, her voice sharper than she intended. "That I'd be upset? That I'd want you to stay?" He flinched, guilt evident in his expression. "Yes," he admitted, "and scared of how much I care about you. Leaving, it feels like I'm betraying us." Amara looked at him, her heart aching at the sincerity in his eyes. "But you're still leaving," she said quietly. Ryan reached across the table, his hand hovering near hers. "This opportunity, it's everything I've worked for. But it doesn't mean I don't love you, Amara." The word hung in the air between them, heavier than she had ever imagined it could be. She felt her throat tighten, the tears she'd been holding back threatening to spill. "You love me," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "And yet you're asking me to let you go." Ryan's hand dropped, his shoulders sagging. "I don't want to lose you," he said, "but I don't know how to stay." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The cafe buzzed around them, the clinking of cups and murmur of conversation creating a world they no longer felt part of. Finally, Amara took a deep breath. "I won't ask you to stay," she said, "but I can't pretend this doesn't hurt. I don't know if I can do this." Ryan looked shattered, but he nodded. "I understand," he said, his voice breaking. I want you to know that meeting you has been the best thing that's ever happened to me." Amara couldn't hold back the tears anymore. She stood abruptly, grabbing her coat. "I need to go," she said, her voice trembling. Ryan rose too, his expression stricken. "Amara." "Goodbye, Ryan," she whispered, her voice cracking as she turned and walked out into the cold. The weeks that followed were some of the hardest Amara had ever endured. She threw herself into her art, sketching furiously as if she could channel the pain into her work. Her sketchbook filled with images of Ryan. His hands, his smile, the way he looked at her under the stars. She tried to avoid the places they had frequented together, but the city seemed to conspire against her. Everywhere she went, she saw pieces of him. A cafe they'd sat in, a park bench where they'd laughed, the bookstore where he'd bought her a copy of Cosmos by Carl Sagan. One snowy evening, she found herself at Mount Royal, standing at the summit where they had once held hands and shared their first kiss. The city stretched out before her, its lights blurred by the tears streaming down her face. She didn't hear Ryan approach until he was right behind her. "I didn't think you'd be here," he said softly. Amara turned to face him, her heart aching at the sight of him. He looked as tired as she felt, his face pale and drawn. "I couldn't stay away," she admitted. "I'm leaving tomorrow," Ryan said, his voice breaking. "But I couldn't go without seeing you one last time." Amara's chest tightened. "Ryan, He stepped closer, pulling her into his arms. She didn't resist, burying her face in his coat as the tears came freely. They stood there, wrapped in each other as the snow fell around them. "I love you," Ryan whispered against her hair. "I always will." Amara pulled back, her hands trembling as she cupped his face. "I love you too," she said, her voice barely audible. "But I can't follow you, Ryan. I have to stay here. I have to find my own path." "I know," he said, his voice heavy with sorrow. Their goodbye was silent, a final kiss lingering in the cold air before he walked away. Amara watched him go, her heart breaking with every step. As his figure disappeared into the falling snow, she turned back to the city. She stood there for a long time, letting the cold seep into her skin, until the lights blurred together and the snow swallowed the world whole. Final chapter, Echoes in the Snow. The weeks after Ryan's departure were a blur. Amara's world felt emptier, quieter, as if his absence had stolen some of its vibrancy. The cafe where they'd shared their first date, the bookstore with its dusty aisles, even the summit at Mount Royal, all of it carried his ghost. But life moved on, as it always does. Amara immersed herself in her art, channeling her grief into her sketches and paintings. Her style changed in ways she didn't anticipate. Softer lines, muted colors, a melancholy beauty that felt raw and honest. One evening, as she packed up her supplies in the small studio she rented downtown, her phone buzzed. She hesitated before picking it up. It was a text from Ryan. "Cambridge is incredible. The work is demanding, but I'm learning so much. I hope you're doing okay. I miss you." Amara stared at the message, her chest tightening. She wanted to reply, to tell him about her art, about the emptiness she still felt. But instead, she locked her phone and slipped it into her bag. Some things were better left unsaid. Months turned into a year, and the city shifted with the seasons. Amara found new routines, new inspirations. She enrolled in an advanced art program and began showcasing her work in small galleries. Her pieces caught the attention of critics and buyers alike, and she started to carve a name for herself in the Montreal art scene. But despite her growing success, there were moments when the ache of Ryan's absence returned. On snowy evenings, she would find herself walking to Mount Royal, gazing out over the city, and remembering the warmth of his hand in hers. One such evening, nearly 2 years after Ryan had left, Amara was on her way home from a gallery opening. The streets were quiet, the snow falling in gentle flakes that glimmered under the streetlights. She passed by the cafe where they'd first met and paused, a bittersweet smile tugging at her lips. She almost didn't notice the figure sitting by the window, a book in his hands. But something about the way he turned the pages caught her attention. Her heart skipped a beat as recognition set in. It was Ryan. Amara froze, her breath catching in her throat. For a moment she considered walking away, letting the past remain in the past. But something, curiosity, hope, or perhaps the weight of unfinished stories, compelled her to step inside. The bell above the door chimed, and Ryan looked up. His eyes widened in surprise, and then a slow, disbelieving smile spread across his face. "Amara," he said, standing up. "Ryan," she replied, her voice barely audible. He gestured to the seat across from him, just as he had on that first night. Amara hesitated for only a moment before sitting down. They talked, about everything and nothing. He told her about his time at Cambridge, how he had thrown himself into his research but had never quite stopped thinking about her. She told him about her art, about how her career had blossomed in his absence. "I saw your work online," he admitted. "It's beautiful, raw, honest." Amara blushed, the compliment warming her more than it should have. "Thank you." They lingered over their conversation, the cafe's warmth cocooning them from the winter outside. But as the night deepened, reality crept back in. "Are you back in Montreal for good?" Amara asked, her voice cautious. Ryan shook his head. "Just visiting," he said. "I've been offered a permanent position at Cambridge. I fly back next week." The words landed like a blow, and Amara's heart sank. She had hoped, foolishly, that their paths might finally align. "I see," she said, forcing a smile. Ryan reached across the table, his hand brushing hers. "I never stopped loving you," he said, his voice soft but firm. Amara's eyes filled with tears. "And I never stopped loving you," she admitted. They sat there in silence, their hands clasped together as the snow continued to fall outside. For a moment it felt as if time had frozen, as if the universe were giving them a second chance. But some loves aren't meant to last. When they finally said goodbye, it was with the quiet understanding that their lives were moving in different directions. They hugged tightly, holding on as if to imprint the moment into their souls. As Ryan walked away, disappearing into the snowy night, Amara didn't cry. She stood there, watching until he was gone, her heart heavy but full of gratitude. Some people, she realized, come into your life to leave a mark, to show you a different way of seeing the world. And while Ryan was no longer part of her future, he would always be part of her story. Turning toward the city, Amara pulled her coat tighter and walked away, her steps steady against the snow-covered streets. She had loved, she had lost, and she had found herself again. Chapter 1: A Whiff of Change. The small university town of Evergreen was known for its old-world charm. Narrow cobblestone streets wove through rows of vintage bookshops, cafes, and flower stalls, each exuding a sense of timelessness. Against this picturesque backdrop, Ellie Maynard had built a comfortable, if uneventful, life. A literature major in her final year, she found her solace in books and the whispered stories of their pages. It was a late September afternoon when it all began. The golden light of the sun filtered through the maple trees lining the campus quad, casting a warm glow on the worn paths. Ellie had just stepped out of Professor Hayward's Victorian literature seminar, her notebook clutched tightly against her chest. The moment was ordinary, until she bumped into him. "Sorry," she stammered, glancing up to meet a pair of strikingly green eyes. They belonged to a tall, slightly disheveled man with dark, wavy hair that brushed against the collar of his leather jacket. "Don't be," he replied, his voice smooth and calm, with a faint British lilt. "I wasn't watching where I was going." Ellie noticed the book he was holding, Wuthering Heights. "You like Bronte?" she asked, surprised. Most people she encountered read Bronte begrudgingly, for class rather than pleasure. He smiled, a crooked, boyish grin that made her stomach flip. "I suppose you could say I'm a fan of tragic romances." "That makes one of us," Ellie quipped. She didn't know what possessed her to keep talking. Normally, she avoided prolonged conversations with strangers, especially charming ones who exuded an air of mystery. "I'm Theo," he introduced himself, extending a hand. His fingers were warm, firm. "Ellie." "Well, Ellie," Theo said, glancing at her notebook, "what's your take on tragic romances? Overrated or timeless?" The question spiraled into an unexpected exchange as they walked together. Theo had a way of talking, weaving humor into intellectual debate that left Ellie captivated. By the time they reached the library steps, her cheeks ached from smiling. "Coffee tomorrow?" he asked, pausing at the entrance. Ellie hesitated. She rarely made spontaneous plans, let alone with strangers. But there was something about Theo, a magnetism that felt impossible to ignore. "Okay," she agreed, feeling a strange mix of anticipation and dread. The next day, they met at Finch's, a cozy cafe tucked in a quiet corner of Evergreen. Over steaming mugs of coffee, they talked for hours. Theo shared stories of growing up in London, his love for literature, and his knack for playing the piano. Ellie, in turn, opened up about her childhood in the countryside, her dream of becoming a writer, and her favorite authors. Theo wasn't just interesting. He was interested. He asked questions, listened intently, and seemed genuinely fascinated by the smallest details of her life. By the end of their conversation, Ellie felt a spark she hadn't experienced in years. "I'd love to show you something," Theo said as they left the cafe. Intrigued, Ellie followed him to an old abandoned clock tower on the edge of town. The building had long been a local legend, rumored to be haunted. Theo led her inside, up the creaking spiral staircase to a room filled with broken gears and a panoramic view of the town below. "This is my sanctuary," he said, his voice soft. "When life feels overwhelming, I come here. It reminds me that time, no matter how relentless, can also stand still." Ellie gazed at him, her heart thudding. She had never met anyone like Theo, someone who made the world feel both bigger and smaller all at once. For weeks they continued meeting, exploring hidden corners of the town, sharing secrets and exchanging laughter. Ellie found herself falling, helplessly, into the depths of what felt like a dream. The dream shattered on a cold November evening. Ellie had agreed to meet Theo at the clock tower, their usual rendezvous point. But when she arrived, the air felt heavy, charged with something she couldn't name. "Theo?" she called, climbing the staircase. At the top, she found him standing by the window, silhouetted against the pale moonlight. His expression was unreadable. "Ellie," he began, his voice trembling, "there's something I need to tell you." She stepped closer, her chest tightening. "What is it?" He turned to face her, his green eyes clouded with emotion. "I'm not who you think I am." "What are you talking about?" she asked, confused. Theo took a deep breath. "I wasn't supposed to stay this long. I only came here for a moment, a fragment of something I lost. But then I met you." Ellie's mind raced. "Stay this long? Theo, what are you saying?" "I'm not from here," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Not from this time." A deafening silence filled the room. Ellie felt as if the floor beneath her had disappeared. "I've lived this life before," Theo continued, tears glistening in his eyes. "Over and over, endlessly. And every time I find you, every time I fall in love with you, but no matter what I do, it always ends the same way." "What do you mean?" Ellie asked, her voice breaking. Theo reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I'm caught in a loop, Ellie. A loop where I lose you. And this time is no different." Before Ellie could respond, the room began to glow. A faint, golden light enveloped Theo, growing brighter by the second. "No!" Ellie cried, grabbing his arm. "Don't leave." "I don't want to," Theo said, his voice choked with emotion. "But I have no choice." The light consumed him, and in an instant, he was gone. Ellie stood alone in the clock tower, her heart shattered, her mind reeling. Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall, blanketing the town in silence. For the rest of her life, Ellie would return to the clock tower, waiting, hoping, and remembering the love that had transcended time, even if only for a moment. Chapter 2: Echoes of the Past. For weeks after Theo vanished, Ellie walked through Evergreen as though in a dream. The vibrant colors of autumn faded into the muted grays of winter, and yet she couldn't shake the feeling that time itself had stopped the night he disappeared. She avoided the clock tower, afraid of the haunting emptiness it now held, but her thoughts were never far from him. Who was Theo? What did he mean by a loop? And most painfully, why had he chosen her only to leave her behind? It was early December when Ellie found herself sitting in Finch's cafe, nursing a lukewarm cup of tea. Snow fell steadily outside, painting the town in a delicate white. The cafe buzzed with conversation, the warmth of human connection a stark contrast to the hollow ache in her chest. She pulled out her notebook, the one Theo had once teased her about, and began to write. Not essays or stories, but questions. Who was he really? What did he mean by reliving this life? Was any of it real? Her pen stilled, hovering over the page. Do I even want to know? Still taking notes on life? Ellie's head snapped up, her heart racing. The voice wasn't Theo's, but it had the same calm, assured tone. The speaker was a woman, tall and striking, with short jet-black hair and piercing blue eyes. She wore a trench coat dusted with snow, and an enigmatic smile curved her lips. "Excuse me?" Ellie asked cautiously. The woman slid into the seat across from her without waiting for an invitation. "You're Ellie, aren't you? The girl from the clock tower." Ellie's breath caught. "How do you know that?" The woman leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. "I knew Theo," she said simply. Ellie froze, her mind a whirlwind of emotions, relief, suspicion, hope. "Who are you?" "My name's Zara," the woman said. "And before you ask, no, I'm not from here either." Ellie blinked, trying to process the cryptic statement. What does that even mean? Zara sighed as if she had explained this many times before. Theo wasn't lying when he said he wasn't from this time. He and I, we're part of something larger, something complicated. Let's just say we don't experience time the way you do. Ellie shook her head, frustration bubbling to the surface. Why can't anyone just explain things in plain English? What happened to him? Why did he leave? Zara's expression softened. Because he didn't have a choice. Theo is trapped in a temporal cycle, one that's been repeating for centuries. Every time he meets you, every time he falls for you, and every time something tears you apart. Ellie's hands trembled as she clutched her notebook. Why? Why does it keep happening? Zara hesitated, then leaned in closer. Because you're the key, Ellie, to breaking the loop. The weight of the statement left Ellie speechless. I don't know why you're the key, Zara continued. That's something even Theo doesn't fully understand. But I do know this. If you want to see him again, if you want to end this cycle, you'll need to be brave enough to face the truth. Ellie stared at her, a mix of fear and determination churning within her. How do I do that? Zara smiled faintly, pulling a folded piece of paper from her pocket and sliding it across the table. Start here. The clock tower is just the beginning. Ellie unfolded the paper to reveal a map, hand-drawn and filled with cryptic symbols. At its center was a marking labeled The Crossing. Find the crossing, Zara said, standing. And remember, time isn't always what it seems. Before Ellie could ask another question, Zara slipped out of the cafe, disappearing into the snowy streets. Ellie spent the rest of the night poring over the map. It didn't resemble anything she recognized. No streets, no landmarks, just an abstract maze of lines and symbols. Yet something about it felt familiar, as if it tugged at a memory she couldn't quite reach. By morning, she had made up her mind. Clutching the map, she ventured out into the cold. Her first stop was the library, where she combed through old records and maps of Evergreen, hoping to find a clue about the crossing. Hours turned into days, and frustration mounted as every lead turned into a dead end. But then, tucked away in a dusty corner of the library, she found it, a photograph of the clock tower dated 1897. Beneath it was a caption, The Crossing, where time stands still. Ellie's heart raced. She had been searching far and wide, only to realize that the answer had been in the clock tower all along. That evening, she returned to the tower, bracing herself against the biting wind. The interior was just as she had left it, cold, dark, and empty. But this time, she noticed something she hadn't before. An inscription etched into the wall near the base of the clock mechanism. The words were faint, worn with age, but she could just make them out. Turn the hands, and the truth shall find you. Ellie stared at the clock's massive gears and hands, her pulse quickening. Could it really be that simple? She climbed the rickety staircase to the clock face, her breath visible in the freezing air. The hands of the clock were stuck at 11:58, as they had been for years. With trembling fingers, she reached for the minute hand and began to turn it. The effort was immense. The mechanism groaned and protested, but Ellie pushed on. As the hand approached 12, the air around her seemed to hum with energy. Suddenly, a brilliant light erupted from the clock face, engulfing the entire room. Ellie shielded her eyes, feeling the world shift beneath her feet. When the light faded, she found herself standing not in the clock tower, but in a lush, verdant field under a sky streaked with gold and violet, and there, in the distance, was Theo. But he wasn't alone. A figure loomed behind him, shrouded in shadows, watching her with an intensity that sent chills down her spine. "Ellie," Theo called, his voice filled with equal parts joy and warning. "You shouldn't have come." She took a step forward, her resolve unshaken. "I'm not leaving without answers." The shadowy figure laughed, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to echo across the field. Chapter 3. The Game of Shadows. The golden and violet hues of the strange sky shimmered like the surface of a restless sea, casting long, wavering shadows over the verdant field. Ellie's pulse thundered in her ears as she stepped closer to Theo, who stood frozen, his expression an unreadable mix of fear and determination. The shadowy figure behind him shifted, its form undefined yet menacing. It seemed to breathe darkness, the edges of its silhouette unraveling and reforming like smoke caught in a windless room. "I knew you'd come," the figure said, its voice both deep and eerily melodic, resonating in a way that made Ellie's skin crawl. Theo turned to her, his green eyes desperate. "Ellie, you shouldn't have followed the map. You shouldn't be here." "But I am," she said firmly, her voice steadier than she felt. "You said this was a loop, that it's always the same. But if I'm the key, maybe this time it doesn't have to end the same way." The shadowy figure chuckled. "Ah, such defiance. That's what makes you different, Ellie. Always so certain that you can change what's already written." "Who are you?" Ellie demanded, her fists clenched. The figure tilted what might have been its head, the motion oddly human yet deeply unnatural. "I am the warden of the cycle, the keeper of the eternal game. And you, my dear, are both player and prize." Ellie's stomach turned. "Game? What game?" Theo stepped forward, placing himself between Ellie and the warden. "Stop this," he said, his voice laced with fury. "She doesn't need to know." "Oh, but she does," the warden replied smoothly, the shadows around it swirling faster. "The game cannot proceed without her understanding the stakes." It turned its attention back to Ellie as though Theo were an afterthought. "This loop, this cycle, it exists because of a choice you made. Long ago, a choice that rippled through time and bound you to Theo. Each repetition is a chance to undo that choice, to end the loop. But so far, you've failed. Every single time." Ellie's breath hitched. "What choice?" "What did I do?" The warden's laughter echoed, cold and mocking. "Oh, my dear, we'll get to that. But first," it gestured to the ground beneath them, and the field began to transform. Grass gave way to polished stone, and the sky darkened into a dome of endless black, speckled with unfamiliar constellations. Ellie and Theo now stood on what looked like a massive chessboard, the squares stretching into the horizon. Strange, humanoid figures appeared on the board, each one shimmering faintly, like reflections on water. "The rules are simple," the warden said, its voice now booming. "You and Theo will navigate this game together. Each move will reveal a piece of the truth you seek. But beware, every step brings risk, and the closer you get to the end, the harder it will be to continue." Ellie's heart pounded. "And if we win?" The warden leaned forward, its shadowy form towering over her. "If you win, the cycle ends. Freedom. A life untouched by this madness. And if we lose?" Theo asked, his voice tight. The warden's grin, though invisible, was palpable. "Then the loop resets, and you both return to the start, losing everything you've gained in this iteration. And perhaps, this time, I won't be so kind." Ellie looked at Theo, her resolve solidifying. "We don't have a choice," she said. Theo hesitated, his jaw clenched. "You don't understand what you're agreeing to. This isn't just a game, it's a test, a cruel one, and it's designed for us to fail." "But we've never played it together before, right?" Ellie countered. "This time, we're doing it differently." Theo stared at her, the weight of centuries in his eyes. Finally, he nodded. "Together, then." Their first move was tentative. The shimmering figures on the board revealed themselves as memories, fragments of past cycles. Each time Ellie stepped onto a square, the memory played out around her like a vivid dream. The first memory was set in a bustling 18th century market. Ellie saw herself wearing a simple dress, laughing as Theo handed her a flower. But the memory darkened quickly. Soldiers appeared, their faces obscured, dragging Theo away. Ellie screamed, powerless to stop them. As the memory faded, Ellie stood frozen, her heart racing. I remember that, she whispered. It feels like a dream I've had 100 times. Because it is, Theo said, his voice heavy. Each cycle is a variation of the same story. We meet, we fall in love, and then we lose each other. Ellie took a deep breath, pushing down the wave of despair. Not this time. They moved forward, square by square, each step revealing another memory. The 1920s, where they danced in a speakeasy until the police raided the place. The 1940s, where they hid in a bomb shelter, clinging to each other as the world outside fell apart. The 1960s, where Theo's photograph hung in a gallery, and Ellie stood alone, mourning him. Every memory ended in heartbreak. As they approached the center of the board, the memories became sharper, more vivid, and more painful. Ellie felt the weight of each life they had shared, each love they had lost. Finally, they reached the penultimate square. The warden appeared again, its form towering over them like a storm cloud. One step remains, it said, but before you can proceed, you must face the choice that began it all. The board dissolved into darkness, and Ellie found herself standing in a grand, candlelit hall. At the center of the room was a massive mirror, its surface rippling like water. Go on, the warden urged. Look. Ellie approached the mirror, her reflection shimmering and then fading to reveal a younger version of herself. She stood in an ancient library, holding a book bound in black leather. The younger Ellie opened the book, her eyes wide with curiosity. She read aloud from its pages, her voice trembling with an incantation. Theo appeared in the reflection, standing in the shadows, reaching out to stop her. Ellie, don't! He shouted. But it was too late. A burst of golden light erupted from the book, and the younger Ellie collapsed to the floor. Theo caught her, his face etched with anguish. The reflection faded, leaving Ellie staring at her own horrified expression. You bound yourselves to the cycle, the warden said, its tone almost gleeful. You with your insatiable curiosity, and Theo with his foolish heart. The book was a relic, a fragment of time itself. You opened it, entwining your fates across centuries. Ellie turned to Theo, her voice trembling. Why didn't you tell me? I tried, he said, his voice breaking. Every cycle I've tried. But the warden always ensures you forget, until now. Ellie clenched her fists, fury and guilt warring within her. How do we end it? The warden laughed. That, my dear, is for you to discover. But I will tell you this. To break the cycle, one of you must let go. The words hung in the air like a death knell. Let go of what? Ellie demanded. But the warden only smiled as the board reappeared, the final square gleaming ahead. Step forward and find out. Chapter 4. The Final Choice. The board before them stretched out like a labyrinth, the last square shining like a distant star in the endless black. Ellie's breath hitched in her chest as she stared at it. The warden's words echoed in her mind. One of you must let go. But let go of what? Theo stood beside her, his gaze fixed on the final square, but his expression was unreadable. His hand twitched, as though he wanted to reach for hers, but held back. The warden's presence loomed in the shadows, watching them with a cruel, knowing smile. What does it mean? Ellie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The choice, Theo murmured, is yours, always has been. The cold weight of his words settled over her like a shroud. She knew, deep down, that this moment would define everything. If they crossed the final square, the cycle could end, or it could begin again. Why does it always have to end in loss? Ellie's voice trembled as she turned toward him. Why can't we just be together? Theo's eyes softened with a mixture of sadness and love. Because in every cycle, there's always a sacrifice. We can't have everything, Ellie. Not everything we want, not all at once. The warden's laughter echoed in the dark, deep and sinister. He's right, Ellie. The truth is, love isn't enough to break the cycle. There's always something that must be given up, a piece of you, or a piece of him. Ellie's heart pounded in her chest. Her mind raced. She had always believed that love could conquer all, that if they fought hard enough, they could find a way out of the endless loop. But now, with the warden's words hanging in the air, she wondered if there was a part of the story she had never understood. Tell me what I have to do, Ellie said, more forcefully this time, her voice carrying a hint of desperation. I want to end this. I don't care what the price is. I won't let it keep repeating. Theo shook his head slowly, his voice full of regret. You can't just erase the past. We've both tried. It's what keeps us locked in this cycle. But the truth is, if we want freedom, we'll have to choose. One of us must remain, and the other must leave. Ellie felt a jolt of panic shoot through her. Must leave? The words rang in her head, their meaning sinking in with cruel clarity. "You're asking me to let you go," she said, her voice trembling with the weight of the choice. Theo's eyes locked onto hers, his green gaze full of sorrow. "No, Ellie, I'm asking you to choose. If you step forward alone, the loop ends. But I can't do that for you. You must choose to break free from this pattern." Ellie shook her head violently, her breath shallow and rapid. I can't lose you again." The warden stepped closer, its voice low and resonant. "But what if you can't save him? What if saving him means losing yourself, your future, your happiness?" Ellie turned to face the warden, anger surging through her. "Stop it. I don't care about happiness without him." The warden smiled, a smile that didn't reach its eyes. "Ah, but you don't understand, do you? You've always been the one to make the choice. The sacrifice is always tied to you, Ellie. The truth of the cycle is this: the one who loves the most is the one who must give the most. And in the end, you will choose either freedom or love, but you cannot have both." Theo's voice cut through the tension. "Ellie, you don't have to choose now. I've been through this before. I know how it works. But this time, it can be different. You're right about one thing. We can't do it alone. We can't end this alone." Ellie's mind was a whirlpool of confusion. She felt like she was drowning in choices, the weight of the past and the future crashing over her. Was there any way to rewrite the story? Could she end the cycle without losing Theo? Could she find a way to break free without sacrificing what they had? But no answer came, and the warden's voice grew louder, more insistent. "You've been through countless cycles, and each time you've failed. Love is not enough to break the cycle. The choice must be made." Ellie's heart pounded in her chest, a thunderous roar that drowned out everything else. She could feel the final square beckoning, the point of no return, the last step before everything changed, before everything ended. And then, in the silence that followed the warden's ultimatum, a thought struck her. A possibility she hadn't considered before. What if the answer wasn't to choose between them? What if the answer is not to choose at all? Ellie said aloud, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions that raged inside her. Theo blinked in confusion, his eyes searching hers. "What do you mean?" Ellie turned to face the warden, her expression hardening. "You said it yourself. This cycle has happened over and over. But you also said something else, that I am the key to breaking it. Not just me alone, but together, we could change everything." The warden's smile faltered. "Impossible. The rules have always been the same. Love is a cycle. Sacrifice is inevitable." Ellie stood her ground. "What if I don't accept those rules? What if I refuse to play the game anymore?" The warden's form flickered, shadows swirling around it in a chaotic dance. "You cannot defy the cycle!" it roared, its voice breaking through the tension like a crack of thunder. But Ellie didn't flinch. She took a deep breath, her hand outstretched toward Theo. "I choose us. I choose to rewrite the end of the story. If we can't be bound by time, then we will break it, together." And with that, they stepped forward, hand in hand, toward the final square. For the first time, the warden's laughter faltered, then stopped entirely. The world around them trembled, the edges of the board shattering like glass. The dark sky cracked open, light pouring through, and the figures on the board disappeared into the void. As they took the final step, Ellie felt a strange, undeniable shift. Time no longer felt like a prison. It was fluid, free, and untethered. The air hummed with a new possibility. Ellie squeezed Theo's hand, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, the cycle broke. Together, they had rewritten their fate. Chapter 5. The Breaking of the Cycle. The world was silent. Ellie stood in the midst of an empty field, her breath coming in steady, even pulls. The last square of the game was gone, as were the shadows of the warden, the ominous figures, the grand chessboard, everything that had defined the endless loop. The air was clear, untainted by the weight of 1,000 cycles. Time itself, once oppressive and unyielding, now seemed like a distant memory. She glanced at Theo, who stood beside her, his green eyes wide with awe. There was no grandiose moment, no final twist, just an overwhelming sense of release. The tension that had bound them together through countless iterations of love, loss, and sacrifice had disappeared, leaving only the quiet hum of possibility. Did we do it? She asked, her voice trembling with the enormity of the question. Theo looked at her, and a smile broke across his face. A smile so genuine, so full of peace, that it seemed to erase the pain of all the cycles before. He reached for her hand and squeezed it, his warmth grounding her. I think we did. The landscape around them seemed to shimmer and shift, the field of green transforming into a panorama of color and light. The sky was no longer a murky void, but a brilliant expanse of blue, dotted with clouds that stretched across the horizon like a canvas yet to be painted. The air smelled fresh, crisp, like it had never known the weight of time. Ellie closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the breeze against her skin, feeling something she hadn't felt in lifetimes. Freedom. We're free, she whispered, not needing to hear the words spoken aloud to believe them. Theo nodded, his gaze soft and thoughtful. Yes, we're free. But there was something in his voice, something unspoken. Ellie turned to him, her brow furrowing. What is it? She asked, already suspecting the answer. Theo hesitated, looking at their intertwined hands before meeting her gaze. I thought maybe this would feel different, like there would be fireworks or some kind of grand finale, but instead it's just quiet. He paused, as if weighing the truth of his words. I thought we'd earned the happy ending, Ellie. Ellie's heart twisted at the undercurrent of doubt in his voice. You're scared, aren't you? Theo exhaled slowly, his eyes clouded with a hint of uncertainty. I'm not scared of what comes next. I'm scared that maybe this is too good to be true. Ellie stepped closer, lifting her chin to look into his eyes. Theo, she began softly, we've been through so many cycles, so many versions of this story, but we chose this. This is the one we get to keep. The past is gone, and the future is unwritten. This moment, right now, is ours. He looked at her with something akin to wonder, as if he were seeing her for the first time, or perhaps seeing her truly for the first time. He smiled, a slow, warm smile that filled her chest with an unfamiliar lightness. Right, he said. This moment is ours. They stood together, side by side, their hands still intertwined. The sky above them seemed to breathe with life, every cloud a reminder that they were no longer trapped in the web of fate. Every breath they took was one of their own choosing, every step ahead unmarked by the ghosts of past failures. And then, just as Ellie was beginning to believe that maybe they had truly escaped the cycle, a faint echo of the warden's voice reached them. The game is never truly over, it whispered in the wind. Ellie stiffened, her heart skipping a beat. No, it can't be, she murmured, her voice shaky. We ended it. Theo's expression hardened. He took a step back, eyes scanning the horizon. I don't think the warden ever truly left. It's always been there, watching us, waiting for us to falter. Ellie's chest tightened, but she refused to let fear rule her. She turned to Theo, determination flooding her veins. Then we'll fight it. Again. We'll break it for good. Theo met her gaze, and in his eyes she saw a flicker of something old and familiar, something they had shared in every cycle before, but now transformed. It wasn't fear this time, it was strength. Together, he said, the word echoing between them like a vow. They faced the horizon together, their hearts beating in unison, as the wind swirled around them, the sun now rising higher in the sky. No longer would they be bound by the warden's games, by the cycles of loss and sacrifice. This was their world now, the one they would build, piece by piece, the one they would fight for. And for the first time, Ellie felt the true weight of that promise. Freedom wasn't just about escaping the cycle, it was about choosing to live beyond it. With Theo by her side, there was no force in time or space that could hold them back. They were free, and this time, they would keep it. As the final remnants of the warden's presence faded into the wind, Ellie and Theo took their first step forward into the unknown, together, and for the first time, the cycle was truly over.